Hello, everyone, and welcome to our discussion for the Jesus in the Feasts conference for Hanukkah 2021. I'm Ryan White, and I have with me three awesome and amazing teachers that had agreed in a very short amount of time to be present and help out with this conference, providing teachings. We all know each other. We've worked together for years, and we're constantly sharing ideas, bouncing things off of one another. And so I just want to say thank you for being a part of this. And let's go ahead and just get started by if you could introduce yourself and just a little bit about what this conference slash project slash idea means to you. So, Dina, do you want to start us off?
Of course. So I'm Dr. Dina Dye with Foundations in Torah. So this was kind of Ryan's idea, and we all embraced it almost right away. That the idea is to be able to present the feasts, which are very foundational in the scriptures. Honestly, when people are starting to move into this understanding, the feast is the first place they go because it's the easiest to engage, kind of the easiest to understand. And, who doesn't like a good meal and getting together? So, those of you who know me know I've probably been celebrating Hanukkah for like 69 years. So it's kind of in the DNA. But the one thing I feel, we end up arguing over, traditions. And we wanted to do something where we didn't do that. We also wanted to present material that would go out to a wider audience, not just be confined kind of the Hebrew roots messianic thing, but how do we reach people in the church so that they can see the value in these festivals? And maybe not, they may not celebrate them, and that doesn't really matter. But how do these festivals and our understanding about what Yeshua did, how's that going to increase their relationship and their faith with God and God Himself? So that was my thinking and my approach as I put together the material. And I did two 1 hour teachings, one dealing with the historical aspect and one the biblical, and those two things really meld together well for me. So hopefully I present it in a way that isn't too deep, but yet it is, especially when it comes to historical, because there's so much materials. It was a little challenging trying to break that down and just present the high points. So I'm really excited about this. I think it's a great opportunity, and will be the first of many.
Yes. Excellent. Thank you. And your ministry is?
Foundations in Torah,
Thanks.
not to be confused with Founded in Truth. They're both FIT.
I actually did get someone saying, "Hey, you put it on there wrong," and actually I had it on there right. It was.
Sorry about that. You guys definitely came first.
Happy to be a member of the FIT club.
All right, Matthew, you want to go next? Vanderils.
Oh, for sure. My name is Matthew Vanderels. I'm a pastor at Founded in Truth Fellowship in Rock Hill, South Carolina. We are a Messianic church, and very blessed to be surrounded by that community. But no, this conference is great. I love the idea, and any way that we can hone in on a focus of the importance of Jesus, of course, and the story that leads to Him is of big value to me. But we also have all of these aspects that traditionally are not approached or not focused on as a part of the story of that leads us to Jesus. And Hanukkah is one of those, and I think it's extremely relevant. And so as we can dive in and just kind of build that foundation even larger to focus on Him, I'm a part of that for sure. I'm all for that. So I'm really, really, really excited about this becoming a resource. Not only that I can look back on and my fellowship can glean from, but that can be made public, so everyone can hopefully learn a little bit more about Hanukkah and why it's important for believers.
Nice, thanks, Matt.
Hey, my name is Matt Napper. Can you all hear me? I think I've got a connection issue. Okay. My name is Matt Napper. I'm one of the community pastors at Lighthouse Messianic Fellowship in Monroe, Louisiana. Love the Bible, love the background to the Bible, love historical context. Really love the intertestamental period. So excited about this venture that we're on here. I just had a couple of short videos and one teaching on dedication and the concept of dedication with Hanukkah for this conference. So really excited about providing resources like Ryan said, I think, or Dina, that we didn't come together to really talk about traditions or things that seem to want to divide people, but just to give a resource for people to understand the festivals and the seasons as we go through the calendar year that's historical to Israel and God's people. So really excited about that, and appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, so thank you for being with us. Really quick, I'm Ryan White, Faith of Messiah Ministries. This actually is something I wanted to do for a while. The concept of the intertestamental period, I feel, is just so missed because it's a gap in the Bible, and of course we love to read the Bible. But you get to the New Testament, and all of a sudden you're like, wait a minute, there's all these different groups of people. There's everything is different there. And so it's really been a desire of mine to do something like this. So this has just really been fantastic. This was something that this was actually kind of really spur of the moment. We had discussed this a little bit at Sukkot around a campfire, and I do want to give a shout out to Chris Frankie. He's the senior pastor of HFF. He is responsible for everything with the technology, but he's also really been kind of the glue with our group with getting us together and being the visionary for this. As was talked about a little bit, this isn't just a one-time thing or a one-year thing. This is something that we really want to grow into a platform. Again, not trying to convince people to keep the feast. That's God's role. That's the Holy Spirit's role in things. But we just want to get the information out there, get people excited, get people to know who their Messiah was better by looking at some of these things, these biblical connections that may not have been taught to them growing up. And so the idea here was to create a non-threatening platform, because a lot of times when you're telling someone, hey, I keep the feast and they're biblical and so on and so forth, there is that kind of that underlying, why don't you do it? And so, oftentimes that, rather than turning into a learning experience, it turns into either a debate or someone protecting themselves, trying to show that, hey, I'm actually saved even though I don't do what you do. And so the hope here is that we can grow, and that you're able to present this as a resource, because I'm guessing most of you who are watching this initial conference are people that we know personally that do keep feasts, and so we're hoping that this becomes a platform that you can present to your friends, your coworkers, whomever that comes across in a non-threatening manner that really just helps to grow. The other thing that we'll just address the elephant in the room is we called this the Hanukkah and the Birth of Messiah Conference. We're not by any means suggesting that Yeshua was born on Hanukkah or even necessarily conceived on Hanukkah. The connection here is that in order to really understand the birth narratives and the whole gospel, you've really got to understand the background of what was going on in the first, in the time period leading up to the first century. So let's start off that. I think that's probably the best place to really get started with the conversation here. Is how do you, each of you, how do you view the story of the Maccabees, and how is that important for believers in Jesus who maybe have never heard of this story? Why does this add significance into their life and into their walk and into their understanding of the Gospels?
Okay, someone. Well, the Maccabees, there's nothing new here, but they are sort of the last hurrah before we come into the Herodian dynasty. And so you've got all these hundreds of years before of Israel under the thumb of world empire. And so this, for them, try to imagine, they've gone from the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks. And then here comes this bunch who's kind of dedicated themselves to God and they're liberators after hundreds and hundreds of years. So that's kind of, that part of the story was really important to me to understand what would be in their minds when they saw these people, these fighters, become their liberators after so much oppression. So it really behooves us to try to understand who the Maccabees were and kind of what did they morph into and what was the significance of what they did for the people at that time.
I see you,
Matthew.
Matthew.
Oh, it's my turn.
Something
So I
in
was waiting for that. I thought he was going to speak.
this is a free for all.
Oh, for sure. So this is why it's important. Yeah, I think it's important because we get a glimpse, as Dina said, we get a glimpse from the Judeans or the Jews leaving Babylon, and we get a glimpse of that time period between that and the New Testament, and we have no idea what's going on unless we're familiar with this time period. And so, yeah, we have a culture, the Jewish people, from going into Babylon through the New Testament. You have an entire people group that has known nothing but oppression, know nothing but becoming this a minority in the worldview, nothing but becoming a people group that's just in the way of a major resource, this highway of Judea, and a people that's just constantly kicked to the side. And that is their heritage. That's what every single generation knows. And so when you come to this place where the priestly family stands up and says, hey, anyone who's zealous for his Torah and his covenant, follow me. Let's do this. And they begin to fight back. We have this taste, this sample of independence that has not been grasped in so long. And so I think that is very relevant because, in my opinion, that begins to fuel the real expectation. Not that it wasn't coming, the expectation of the Messianic King, but now we have this excitement, this charge of it. Okay, we can push back. There is an opportunity. There is a way that this king is going to come out and give us liberation. And of course, we know that it looks nothing like what the Maccabees did when Yeshua was born. But it really lays the foundation of when Yeshua was born, why people were expecting a Messianic king that's going to come in with a tank and a gun, an AR-15. Like, that was the expectation, that a warrior king was going to arise as the Messiah. And that's what was so radical about Yeshua. And so for me, that was really impactful of why people had so much of a problem with Yeshua preaching things like loving your enemy. That's not how this is going to work. Or being meek, non-aggressive. What are you talking about? How is that going to work for the reign of God on earth? Because that's not how you win when you play the game of empire. And so it's just hugely, grossly significant for New Testament foundation.
Yeah, and to kind of add to what he's saying there, from a literary perspective, excuse me, the story of the Maccabees really builds on the expectation of what was there in the New Testament literarily. So when we don't have this storyline and this 400-year gap that a lot of people miss out on, they kind of miss the weight of that literary expectation that's been built from Genesis all the way through. And that's definitely not a plug to say that the Maccabees are part of Scripture, but they're part of the literary storyline that brings the historical situation of Israel to the time of Jesus, which I think is very important. And then outside of that, two other things I would say: it's both a source of encouragement and a source of warning, or something along those lines. Because the source of encouragement is that we too can fight back against the culture of the beast, right? And to kind of plug, you've all three done Revelation studies and sermons and stuff like that. So I'll plug all them if you want stuff on Revelation. These three have it. But to push back on the system of the beast, we have that ability to do so in the right way. And I think that's what transforms in the first century from the Maccabees, is that what's the right way. But it's also a source of warning, because we're told in the New Testament to run the race till the end, and that's really sadly what uh, the Maccabees and all of the people in the storyline did not do. They eventually fall back into the temptation of the system of the beast, and we're told to run the race till the end. So it's a storyline of warning if you follow the story all the way through, to say we need to fight back against a culture that wants to suppress us, that wants to subvert the kingdom mindset of Yeshua, but also know that it's got to be a lifelong dedication to doing that.
Yeah, and that was, to me, one of the things that really, I'd read the stories before, but as I went through one of the books, just rereading the history, I mean, it's just it's encouraging and yet heartbreaking at the same time, because you have these people who are truly standing up for faith in God. They're standing up for the little guy. They're standing up against this oppressive beast system that you find in the book of Revelation. Antiochus the Fourth was a horrible, horrible person. And so they win their freedom, and you have this, I mean, to me, after reading these stories, it was like Maccabees is like the Jewish 4th of July, in a sense. Um, so you have this war of independence for religious independence, but then you launch into this dark history of this war for political independence. And they actually didn't win their political independence for 20, 30 years beyond that. And they really, I mean, even when we say political independence, they still were kind of under the influence of these other nations. But then very shortly after, you have civil war. And it just reminds me just how, the United States kind of, you have these parallels. We won our independence, but not that long after winning our independence, we find ourselves in the middle of a civil war. And this is exactly where the Judeans found themselves around like 100 BC. You have this huge war between the Pharisees and the Sadducees siding with the king Alexander Janus. And so, as you're talking there, it's they didn't run the race. They didn't have that perseverance. They won their independence, but then they quickly turned into the exact thing that they had fought against, and honestly, almost worse in some aspects. And of course, all of that ends in a second civil war brewing, when they essentially just invite the Romans to, hey, come in and take over our country. And so I find that not just as a warning to us in that spiritual sense, but I think on a national level. And Dina, I know that you've delved a lot further into the political arena than any of us have, but I mean, that's just where I see it as almost a warning to us today to remember, when we get involved in politics, our involvement in politics is to secure religious freedom. It's to secure our right to worship God, and it's not about trying to take over the world through military conquest, which is exactly where the Hasmoneans turn to.
Yeah, I think one of the key things for me, and I tried to share this in my 2 sessions, because with the Babylon, and King Nebuchadnezzar destroying the temple, they lost a lot, clearly their identity and all those things, but they lost the kingship. And so that's always, the heart of them was always to restore their king. And of course, we had confusion through the intertestamental period, Zerubbabel or whatever, but we land on the Maccabees, and really they take control illegitimately, declaring themselves to be kings and priests and high priest. And so that makes Yeshua's birth even more remarkable, in that the purpose of it was to restore the dynasty of David, because it had been lost in that 400-year period. And so there we have lots of mention of, him being the son of David and the son of God, and this whole restoration of what true kingship is supposed to be. And so this battle between true kingship and this illegitimate false kingship of the world and of world empire just colliding. at the point of his birth is really, and so all of that comes through the Maccabees.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the weight of that, of what you're saying, I used to say, and I think a lot of us probably here have said in the past, that without the Maccabees, Yeshua wouldn't have an Israel to be born into. But I almost think that downplays the significance of how much weight is poured into the birth of Messiah, like you were just saying, Dina, that all of these different scenarios, religious, political, history with the enemies of Israel, all these things are poured into this one single moment where our King is born, and all of those things are subdued. And so I think, just kind of like reflecting back on how I used to portray this story of the Maccabees in relation to Jesus was really, I would just say that and then mention John 10, and that was it. But really, it's a lot more than that, and it goes to what you were saying.
For sure, that was a huge turning point, I think, in my life, because I grew up with a Messianic background, and so we'd do Hanukkah every year, and we'd celebrate the Festival of Lights and dedication. We focused on the dedication of the temple and the Maccabees. And I remember actually, like in fellowships a long time ago, we'd have like a play, a Maccabee play, and we come out with swords. And I think I claimed to actually read through like first, second Maccabees. I don't think I ever did it that time. Like it was only years ago that I actually read through it, and I'm like, what story is this? Because this is not the story that we're celebrating. And the story of the Hasmonean dynasty taking basically, it was through their dynasty that king and high priest started to become synonymous.
Right.
And they should make a show out of this. I mean, it is just generation after generation of political manipulation, exploitation, not only from outside forces, but then it becomes internal. And you have people assassinating each other, brother-in-laws, son-in-laws coming in, killing mothers, like everyone fighting for this iron throne, right? Huge political mess. And it's almost surreal just how you have this small group of rebels, these revolutionaries that want to stand up for what's right. And they do it by the same means that the Greeks, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Romans do it, with exploitation, weapons, violence, and wealth. And they literally turn into the same people, to the point where when they're in power, they begin forcing their religion onto the minorities that they conquered, forcing circumcision onto. I mean, they literally became the Greeks that were forcing their religion on them, inverted. And I just find that so fascinating because it gets dark. The Festival of Lights has a dark background to it, and there's so many lessons to learn from that.
And the irony of that is that King Herod, the Idumean, was one from the people who were forced converted and forced circumcised.
Right.
That's right.
So they end up getting ruled by one of the people that they oppressed.
Yeah. Well, and just the murderous. I mean, thousands of Pharisees slain, right? Alexander,
crucified,
Honest. I mean, it's just the points you're all making is that they turned it into the thing that they were trying to distance themselves from. And so really, it takes us right back to Yeshua's birth and all that he would accomplish. Not, he doesn't necessarily throw off the shackles of Rome, but it is the deliverance for them from the exile in their relationship with God, and how, Yahweh's place in their presence, to return Yahweh to the presence of the people of Israel. And that's the message going forward, because we're not ever going to be able to throw off the shackles of all this geopolitical empire stuff, which is clearly going on now. Same story, repeating. So what are we left with? We have to find in our relationship with Yeshua to return the presence of God into our midst. It's our only hope. And we really see that today in the United States.
Yeah. And I mean, I'd argue that, that whole story, you see why this whole Jesus thing is so powerful. You've got, had he come and done what they wanted him to do, come back and slaughter all the people that they don't like and put them in charge again, the world would have ended up in the exact same place. And I think that's a warning to us today that we shouldn't be looking for some sort of violent revolution, whether that's in whatever country you're in, but and bigger, and this will be a little bit more controversial. We shouldn't be looking for a Messiah who's coming back to slaughter all the people that we don't like either. Um, when you look at the power of the cross, when you look at the power of what Messiah did, what Jesus did, it's absolutely world changing. He taught us that true power doesn't come through defeating your enemies, because if you truly think power comes through that, you're going to end up just like the Hasmoneans, fighting among yourself. I mean, as much as it would be great if our, yours or my particular flavor of belief in the God of Israel came out on top, but if we were in charge, would we really be any better than the Hasmoneans?
Yeah, sometimes we're not. Well, I think it's interesting, because we've talked about the comparisons what we have, that the New Testament in essence is essentially a replay of the Exodus. And so, you think about Israel at the mountain and Sinai, and the giving of the Torah, and then you jump to Yeshua, his birth, and then to me the predominant thing is the Sermon on the Mount. That he, in that, to me, is kind of a replay of the giving of the Torah, only it's greatly expanded, actually explains things in a little more detail. But that's that moment in which this is how you will defeat your enemies. This is how you will take down world empire. This is how you'll be set free and restored from exile. I just find that to kind of be the central place in which we understand how we actually do defeat our enemies, and we do have enemies.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I've been going through Matthew, and I think that's true. I've shared with Matthew Vander Els. I don't think I've talked at length with Dina and Ryan too much about my studies on the Sermon on the Mount, but as I reviewed it over the past year, I've been leading a Bible study on the book of Matthew with some other people outside of our church. And when I looked at the Sermon on the Mount, we always go to Matthew 5:17 and 18 and 19, but we ignore verse 20. After we use those as proof text for obedience to Torah, we ignore verse 20 that says, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees, you'll not inherit the kingdom of God, which is a very strong statement. Mm-hmm. And I've not seen many people address it in our denominational corner. We just kind of ignore it. We focus on the early parts. But as I looked literarily at the rest of the Sermon on the Mount, what Jesus is doing is answering that question. What does it mean to have righteousness that exceeds the Pharisees? Because at their time, that would be such a bold statement. What do you mean? There's no way we could exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees. And so overall, if I could sum up my thoughts on the Sermon on the Mount and what he seeks to answer that question through, is that your righteousness exceeds the Pharisees when you give all glory to God and not yourself. And I think that's part of the downfall of the Hasmoneans and part of the downfall of what happened very shortly after the defeat and the retaking of and rededication of the temple, is when we start focusing on ourselves and we start saying what we did and what we can do and what we can accomplish, as opposed to what God has accomplished through us. I think that becomes a huge issue. And to your point about the difference there, I know I talked to Matthew about this a little bit. He comes down off this mountain that he gives a sermon on, and for Matthew's gospel anyway, he gives it follows with 10 miracles immediately afterwards, as opposed to Mark that doesn't have 10. And so you kind of see this real comparison of Moses to Jesus, and Yeshua being the new Moses, the greater Moses, who doesn't come down with 10 commandments, but 10 healings. And I think to your point, Dana, what really made me think of this is how the world is restored whenever we give God the glory, when we follow Yeshua and his ways, and when we seek to bring the kingdom here, that people are healed, people are restored, no matter who, because the Romans were still in charge of Israel at the time. So the things that Yeshua was doing and the healings and the things that were being brought within the context of an oppressive ruler in our day and age. And so how can we be that light that brings healing to the nations, regardless of who's being oppressed?
That's good.
Nice.
And that makes Ryan, did you want to say something?
No, go ahead.
So you talk about being that light, and that's found that fascinating because that seems to be the trajectory of the story of Hanukkah from, I guess, the earliest recording we have, First Maccabees, all the way up through the Mishnah Talmud commentary, and how the trajectory and the meaning of Hanukkah tends to fluctuate even among the Jewish population. So First Maccabees, the sole focus is the dedication, like the dedication of the altar, the dedication of the temple. That's it. And then you flip over to Second Maccabees, and it's a letter. It's essentially propaganda, but it's a letter to the Jews in Egypt trying to get them to celebrate Hanukkah. And that's when you have all of these miracles, like all of these miraculous things that took place. We had visions going, and the soldiers saw stuff in battle, and God was doing all of these miracles during Hanukkah, and this is why it's a big deal, and this is why you should do it. And that's where we actually get the emphasis on the Feast of Tabernacles. It's like the Feast of Tabernacles and the fire, and the Feast of Fire, like Nehemiah when the fire went up in the altar. And then we jump over to the first century, where we have the writings of Josephus, the Jewish historian in the late first century. And he's giving a commentary on Hanukkah after the Jewish wars have happened, after the Jewish revolts have been squashed by the Romans. So you're back at a time where you're being oppressed, but you've also lost your attempt to revolt. And his commentary mentions nothing about a dedication of a temple. Nothing about miracles happened. He basically says, like they took back the temple and it happened and it's good. But we call it the Festival of Lights. And I have no idea why, but maybe it's because we finally got to at least we were able to worship the way we wanted to again. Like, he totally downplays the revolt itself because they're under Roman oppression, and they lost very recently. And then you skip forward the next few hundred years with the commentary in the Mishnah or the Talmud, where the sole focus of why we celebrate is not necessarily on the Maccabees, not necessarily on the temple. Now it's a miracle, and a very specific miracle that we have no historical reference for, the oil. It's about the miracle of the oil. And a lot of people have an issue with this. They're like, oh, they just made up a miracle, and that never happened. We have no historical, and it may or may not have happened. But I think from a storytelling standpoint, the point wasn't necessarily the oil. It's the fact, exactly what you just alluded to, Dina and Matt, the light that comes through that. And that's where we have this kind of final climactic, if you will, origin story or point of Hanukkah that's pushing the darkness away with light. But I think, and that's for me, I used to celebrate Hanukkah from the aspect of the revolution, and we're going to fight. When you learn the background and what happened after, it gets really dark if that's the reason you're celebrating it. It doesn't give you a big, that's not a great reason because it didn't yield results, but yet the generations after the event, the Jewish people started to understand, it seems, from the documentation we have, it seems, going back and forth, there's a bigger point here, and that's the fact that God is still with us. And that God is going to always perform miracles. He's going to be in our midst, and he's always going to give us the ability to shine light in darkness, no matter what the circumstances are, no matter what the background is. And I think that, I would like to think, that was on the cusp, on the horizon, at the time when Yeshua was born. And maybe he would have piggybacked off of that ethic that was kind of pushed away because everyone wanted a revolution, but he brought it to light, pun. So... I don't know.
That's interesting too, because if you think about it, and maybe it's pure coincidence, but Hanukkah falls during the darkest time of the year when light starts to break forth. That's what's often referred to as the winter solstice. It's just a time that people who don't have their noses in cell phones naturally begin to notice that, it gets dark really early, and now it's starting to the days are starting to get longer, the light is starting to break forth, and so it would make sense why someone would potentially associate a festival of light with a time where the world is at its darkest and in need of that light. So I like that.
That's good.
Well, and that, then the tie to Sukkot, because it's supposed to be the festival of the nations. And so the light is supposed to go to the nations, not just to Israel. And of course,
Mm-hmm.
we have a connection to the menorah and the temple, etc. But that the idea of the fire, which, kind of symbolic of the manifestation of God, if you will. But it was supposed to come out, like we see in the book of Acts, like the tongues of fire, is supposed to come out and it's supposed to spread to the whole world. It's supposed to brighten the whole world, not just Jerusalem. And I think Hanukkah really speaks of, the rescue of humanity, not just the nation of Israel.
Yeah.
And I think Israel, through all that, kind of forgot. And so Yeshua arrives on the scene. I mean, his whole ministry. Think about where he's in the Galilee. He spends all this time, pretty much, except for a few times in the temple in Jerusalem, going back and forth across the Galilee, from the Decapolis back, to the environs of the Jews. And I think, within that, just try to visualize him, crossing the sea and going to the region that the Romans had control over, trying to bring that light. And of course, we have from that scripture in Isaiah, the people
Mm-hmm.
walking in darkness have seen a great light. And speaking of that very region. So there was just something about, that his ministry, even though it was, confined to this specific geographical area, was never meant to be just there.
Yeah. I like that.
Yeah, I love the aspect of him going over the Sea of Galilee, east and west. Especially there's the story Mark 4, and I can't remember exactly in the other Gospels, where he calms the storm and the winds, and I love that miracle. One of my favorites. I went to a different church last week and spoke on that. But it's really interesting how he leaves, like you said, the confines of safety for him or for his disciples, and he's on the western side. He's speaking in parables. He's talking to people that want to follow him. He says, hey, let's get this boat and go across the sea through this storm to end up on the other side, which is darkness, the side of what we would say paganism, the side of unbelief, the side of being away from God and his abode. And he goes and makes this whole journey with all of his disciples in this boat through the storm to set one man free. And then he's like, yep, let's get back in the boat and go across to the other side. So that's just that one little, like, I mean, just in the context of what we're talking about here with light and how that story developed, it's like he just brought one single candle all the way this big journey, handed it off and headed back, I love that aspect of it, just as we're talking.
Nice. Well,
what's some literary? Oh, go ahead, Ryan.
Well, that kind of goes into what you're probably maybe saying. There's, that with this we have not just with the Maccabees, but we have a lot of different literature of the Second Temple period. We have books like Jubilees, obviously Maccabees, Enoch, the Letter of Orestes. There's just so many things out there. And Matt, I know on the social media you'd posted something about a book you were reading, When God Spoke Greek, which is talking about the Septuagint, and the Septuagint was a translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, because most of the world spoke Greek at that time. It would be the same as like the first English translation of the Bible. That was the level of significance of that. Just open up the floor to your guys' thoughts on the importance, not just the importance of the literature, but the importance of us recognizing the importance of the literature. I'll let Matt go first, because he's the resident expert here.
I'll just add to the question and say, what are some literary aspects of the story that are important? For me, one was when I read First Maccabees, I'm noticing, I used to view it just as a story, much like I used to view the Bible. And as I'm reading it, it's not just a story of conquest. And there's 4 unique things in First Maccabees. There's 4 very subtle, beautiful, poetic sections of lament. And so we kind of view this story as, and you've all talked about it so far, we view this story as a source of triumph and celebration. But for a lot of people throughout the story, because it's not like the lament sections are just in the first, second chapter, they go throughout the story. And so that was kind of my question, building on the intertestamental literature that leads us to the New Testament, but also the aspect of storytelling. And I think all of these comments have brought this, Matthew, talking about the development of the tradition and how we tell stories. And so I just think it's really neat how the author of Maccabees 1 chose to tell the story. It could have simply been a historical story, but it's not. It's a story that develops through literature. And so that kind of broadens Ryan's question a little bit more than probably he expected, but just wanted to open up the literary aspect because that's where I, nerd out a good bit.
I think that's really good to bring up because we get so focused on, well, it has to be historically accurate, and there's people who dedicate their entire lives to simply just defending the historical accuracy of the Bible, to the point that they don't even let the Bible be anything other than just a pure historical document. And that's not what ancient writers were trying to do. Even if you look at like timelines and stuff, like one of my professors was pointing this out about Jeremiah's 70 years. If you actually look at it, there's actually nowhere where that 70 years like actually fits within history. They weren't really concerned with literal hit. If it was 71 years, they were still going to call it 70 years because it's about symbolism. It's about telling a story about connecting you with God, not trying to make you a history major.
Yeah, I think that's really key. Really, the whole Bible is structured that way. And yes, we got real people, persons, places, things. Yeah, but the writers, I think it was Walton that said, really, that which we consider of the highest value is the interpretation of the writer. So they on purpose are leaving things, putting things in, leaving things out. And so our job is kind of, okay, why are they bringing that particular piece of information to our attention and leaving out, and the birth of Yeshua probably is a great example, because they could have said he was born on such and such a date at a certain time, right? That would have been really simple. But yet they chose not to, because they didn't, for whatever reason, they didn't want us to focus on that. They wanted us to focus on his actual birth and what that was going to bring. And, as the more I've been studying and researching, it's just amazing to me. So now I kind of cue my eye to look for things that are not in what's not there. And then what did they choose to really emphasize, and focus more on those things instead of worrying about the actual literal historical information. And, that's where we kind of get bogged down. That's where we get into arguments too, because people are just definitive. It was this and it happened there and it was exactly like this. And then we have arguments.
Yeah, and I don't think it should downplay the historicity of the Bible and other stories. I think learning the historicity of King David and the historicity of Jesus is very important. But if that's all we focus on, we'll fall short on the storytelling aspect of what's there. One example from our modern times, The Chosen. I don't know if y'all have seen that series. The Chosen takes a lot of liberties in telling the story. And so people have asked me the question, as someone who studies the Bible extensively, how do you feel about The Chosen and how they add to the story? And my response is, I absolutely love the display of true biblical and ancient storytelling that they've brought to light. Today, we want to report news rather than tell a story. And so storytelling is the nature of the Bible itself. That's all it is. It's a big book compilation library of stories that people have told about God over time. And back to the Sermon on the Mount, that issue, if we're taking the Bible to say it has to be historically accurate, well, we have an issue with Matthew and Mark who tell the story of the Sermon on the Mount differently. Or we have an issue between Luke and the other Gospels of when Jesus's feet are washed. But if we understand the storytelling aspect of they're telling a story for a theological reason, we have to remember that. The Bible is history, but it's not exact history. It's theological history. So I say all that to come back to Matthew's example, or his display and explaining of how the story developed and the traditions developed. did the miracle of the oil happen or not isn't really relevant to the story. The story is there to tell us that the point, and I think Ryan said this, is that the point that we should celebrate is that God is still with us, Emmanuel. And so I think that's regardless of the historicity of the miracle of the oil, the story itself tells us a theological point that we get to celebrate, we get to honor, and we get to bless the world with for God's glory.
For sure. I always tend to portray it with the fellowship, because I have people that come up all the time and ask, hey, what about these differences between the New Testament authors, and why can't they all be chronological? Like someone's messed with it and trying to disprove the Bible and chopped them up, and I've seen people take out whole verses in John and just take them out, and now we can smooth them. No, it's not. This, you have a director, so Mel Gibson, love him, hate him, whatever, Passion of the Christ. That rocked the community when he came out with, was it rated R? It should have been. Passion of the Christ, and directing this film, a portrayal of a director based on scripture, based on the story. And the film hit a little bit different than reading it in reading the passion scenes and the gospel accounts, because the director wanted to emphasize certain things so that he could get apart the way he wanted to tell the story. And I believe Matthew and John, perfect examples. So in one gospel account, you have Yeshua going into the temple and flipping the tables and tying a whip and overturning the money chain, just causing a big ruckus at the end of his ministry. And here you have John starting out his story. He's like, you know what? I'm gonna direct my film differently. We're gonna start his ministry out of him going in the temple and making a ruckus and declaring, and I'm gonna put an emphasis on, he is going to be the true temple. He is the true temple, because John's emphasis, the point of John's film, was to portray Yeshua as the Lamb of God and the new temple being lifted up. And so, but it's wrong. Which one's right? I was like, they are both. They're both. That's the point. That's the point. They don't care whether it was at the end of the ministry or the beginning. They're wanting you to get the actual point and the actual truth, and something that's going to be a lot more edifying to you in the long run, whether when it happened, is the fact that this is the reality of what's going on. He is the Lamb. He is the temple. I blanked out and I lost my connection for a few moments, so I hope no one already went over the.
No,
that's really good.
Well, I can relate, having written a book, because my original book was about 1,000 pages. I'm going, this ain't going to work. So now I got to figure out how to write something that's engaging, but is just focused on the point that I want to make. And so a lot of stuff went on the cutting room floor. And then I had to make it really tight. I couldn't put everything in that I wanted to. So I had that experience kind of helped me, relate a little more to the writers of the gospel, because they're pretty tight with their info. They don't elaborate and embellish much. So that kind of gave me a window understanding into that.
I think of The Fiddler on the Roof. Y'all seen that show? I know, Dina, quintessential Jewish movie. I know it's required viewing for your childhood.
Absolutely.
I don't know how old you were when it came out, but
I won't.
So, yeah, we'll say you were 5, and so I think of that when Matthew is I'm still like meditating on this development of the story and traditions of Hanukkah. I think of the point where he's out there getting milk that morning, and they're all talking around the milk cart. And, if I could put it into what we're talking about, the context here, one guy says, well, the story of the Maccabees and Hanukkah, Hanukkah is about dedication. And this other guy says, no, it's about the lights. And this other guy says, no, it's about triumphant victory over the Greeks. And what's his name? Tevye. Or the other guy says, you can't all be right. And he says, you are also right. And so it is a story that is told, and traditions are given for it. It is about dedication. It is about defeating the social constructs of the system of the beast that wants to oppress us. It is about bringing light into the world. It is about remembering that God is with us. And I think, when we think about the aspect of storytelling, it's all of those things at the same time.
Good.
Absolutely. All right, we've got just over 10 minutes left. So since we keep mentioning God with us, Emmanuel, I'd like to kind of finish up with talking a little bit about the birth of Messiah, and the connection there. And again, we sometimes we get caught up in all the historicity, the trying to figure all this stuff out, the dates and stuff. But I like what I'm hearing here on the underlying current is it's truth, but it doesn't have to be told in a like news report fashion. Truth, I forget who said this, but it was truth is something that changes your world, right? And that I forget who made it, and I'm kind of paraphrasing that, but that's always stuck with me is when you're telling the story of the birth, it's not about just telling someone here's the absolute facts. Obviously there are facts there, and he really was born. But we get so caught up in just those facts that we miss the beauty of what's being told there in the story. I mean, the genealogy. People get caught up. Oh well, is there the last set of 14? It ends with Joseph and then Mary, and if you count, that's only 13, and they get all spun up about this, and there's make different versions of the Bible. You're missing the beauty of and the truth of it, which is there's 5 Gentile women and 2 of them are prostitutes.
Yeah.
One was raped by King David. This is a story of a messed up family, and it all turns out okay. So I mean, to me, just the whole narrative there, we've got to take off our 21st century lens and just look at it from a different perspective and see that it's not about being right or wrong. It's about being invited to this dance in Scripture, this amazing story that just continues every time I reread these, every time I study these, something new comes to light with the birth of Messiah.
Yeah, one of the things that kind of stood out for me, I did share in one of my teachings when we talked about God with you, Emmanuel, is obviously connecting back to Isaiah 7. And people think that that's referring to Isaiah. But if you actually read it, you'll find it speaking about King Hezekiah. He is the son, the virgin son that will come forth. And his father is King Ahaz, who is like the really baddest dude possible, who totally contaminated the temple, went so far as to hire a guy out of Damascus to build an altar that he liked and put it adjacent to the altar in the temple. And so to me, I'm thinking, okay, King Hezekiah did great things, restored the temple, reformed the faith. I mean, he kind of failed in the end, but he really he's so connected to the temple, expanded the temple, etc. And so I see this sort of connection, that Yeshua is making with Hezekiah. But you've got Yeshua's father, Yahweh, and then you've got King Hezekiah's father, and the devil, essentially. Like King Hezekiah's father couldn't be a worse representation of a human being in relationship to the faith at the time. And so there's this juxtaposition of my heavenly father and your father the devil kind of thing going on, and connecting the life of Hezekiah and his connections to the temple, and the cleansing again to the Maccabees. All of these things just kind of are all connected. It's just remarkable. And then the writers are purposely trying to get us to make those connections.
That's good. Super good.
I think I was reading, I'm sure y'all are familiar with, I think it was Michael Morales. This is just off the top of the dome. And it was talking about the importance of the Exodus in the New Testament storyline. And he was suggesting that we really need to know our Old Testaments, because whenever we come across quotations of the Old Testament, we can go back and read those, right? One of my pet peeves is Bibles that Therefore, our benefit, have the notes that give you a reference point to a single verse, and we have a tendency to go read the same verse that was quoted, and we're like, oh yeah, that's that verse. But really, it's supposed to be like a hyperlink that opens up to a whole web page of the whole chapter and the story. And but to Morales's point, what he was trying to say was we can easily look at the quotations, and it may not be Morales. I think it is, but he's written extensively on Exodus in the New Testament. But to his point, or whoever's point, whatever scholar, it's not my point, it's my point. So
that's a good point.
That's a good point. And to whoever's point it was, the key was we need to know the Old Testament stories, because when they're alluded and not quoted in the New Testament, or the New Testament stories, we won't understand those allusions if we don't recognize the stories behind them. Just like we were talking about the Sermon on the Mount, we won't recognize the 10 miracles for what they're worth if we don't know the story of Moses coming down with 10 commandments. Mm-hmm. And I think the same is true as you're talking, Dina, you were just talking with the allusions in the New Testament. If we don't understand the intertestamental period writings to some degree, and the history of Israel that takes place in those 400 years, then we'll miss a lot of the allusions that happen in the New Testament as well.
I think one of the most striking things that I think I glossed over growing up, going to church my whole life, is what took place in the field with the little boys with their sheep. I say little boys, the shepherds and their sheep. And Hanukkah, the story, as we're discussing the turmoil, suffering, death, political unrest, what hope is there? The only hope that this will someday end and we will be free, whatever that looks like. The war will stop, violence will stop, the world will stop being dominated by beasts, Daniel 7 and Revelation. When will this happen? And there was an evening in Bethlehem where a child was born, and the unrest that took place in heaven was so loud, so violent of joy, that the army of Yahweh could not sit still, that they pierced through and ripped open the veil between heaven and earth, because they just could not hold it in enough to tell these shepherds, he's here. He's here. He's in Bethlehem, and he's laying in a feeding trough. Rejoice. And that should bring chills to us every single time we read the Nativity story, because that is the grand impact that it would have made to the first century audience. Mm-hmm. That's how big of a deal it was. It wasn't just a child. It was the Messiah that is going to finally bring the reign of God to earth. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, greatest birthday in history is amazing.
Nice. Love it. All right. Well, we are at time, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time here. I know we could probably talk on this for hours and hours, so again, thank you all for being a part of this. For those of you watching, thank you for listening in, and we hope to have you join us in the future. This is something that we want to continue doing, not just this year, but hopefully year to year, and we'll continue to grow. We'll get articles. We got more people that we want to bring in, and just really make this a really cool thing to bring excitement to our Messiah, Jesus, Yeshua. So thank you all very much.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you. Shalom.